Sarah Martinez stepped out of the corner bodega with a paper bag tucked under her arm, the familiar weight of groceries settling against her ribs. The evening air in downtown Portland carried the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen, mixing with exhaust fumes and the distant aroma of food trucks parked 3 blocks over. She moved with the easy stride of someone who belonged in the city, her sneakers silent against wet pavement as she navigated between puddles that reflected the amber glow of streetlights. The parking garage beneath her apartment building stretched before her like a concrete cavern. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows between the concrete pillars that held up 6 stories of residential living. Sarah's Honda Civic sat in space 247, wedged between a rusted pickup truck and a sedan that had seen better days. She had lived in this building for 8 months now, long enough to know the rhythm of the place. The elevator that groaned between floors, the neighbor who played jazz too loud on weekends, the way the garage echoed every footstep at this hour, when most residents were settled in for the night. What none of her neighbors knew was that Sarah Martinez had spent 12 years in the Navy, SEALs before women were officially allowed in combat roles. She had been part of a classified pilot program, one of 7 women who had endured the same training, the same missions, the same sleepless nights in hostile territory that had forged generations of elite warriors. Her military records were sealed. Her discharge papers listed her as a communications specialist. Even her closest friends at the coffee shop where she worked mornings knew nothing about the scars that traced across her shoulder blades or the way she automatically cataloged exit routes in every room she entered. The transition to civilian life had been harder than any mission she had completed overseas. There were no medals for learning how to sleep through the night again. No commendations for figuring out how to buy groceries without scanning for threats. No recognition for the discipline it took to smile at customers who complained about their lattes while she remembered what real problems looked like. Sarah had chosen Portland because it was quiet, because it rained enough to wash the city clean every few days, and because nobody asked too many questions about where you came from or what you did before you arrived. Tonight felt different, though she couldn't yet identify why. The garage held the same stale air it always did, the same oil stains marking spaces where cars had leaked their mechanical secrets onto concrete. The same security camera blinked red in the corner, its lens pointed toward the entrance ramp. Sarah's internal radar, the one that had kept her alive through 3 deployments, registered a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Nothing visible, nothing she could point to. Just the feeling that the space around her was no longer empty. She walked toward her car with the same measured pace she always used, keys already positioned between her fingers in a grip that looked casual but would prove otherwise if needed. Her peripheral vision cataloged the shadows between vehicles, the stairwell door that led to the residential floors above, the emergency exit that connected to the alley behind the building, the maintenance room where the building's electrical systems hummed behind the locked door. Sarah had been working at Grind Coffee for 6 months, pulling espresso shots and crafting foam art for customers who barely looked up from their phones long enough to say thank you. The job required none of the skills that had defined her military career, but it offered something she had never experienced before: routine without consequence, ordinary problems with ordinary solutions. The biggest crisis of her average day was running out of oat milk or dealing with a customer who insisted their drink was wrong even when it wasn't. Her manager, Derek, was 24 years old and had strong opinions about fair trade coffee and sustainable business practices. He treated Sarah like any other employee, which was exactly what she wanted. He didn't know that she could field, strip a rifle in complete darkness, or that she had once spent 36 hours motionless in a sniper hide while waiting for a target to appear. To Derek, she was just Sarah, the morning shift worker who showed up on time, never called in sick, and had an unusual talent for remembering customer orders. The apartment building housed mostly young professionals and graduate students from the nearby university. Her neighbors were software developers, social workers, artists trying to make rent by walking dogs and delivering food. They complained about student loans and dating apps and whether the building's Wi-Fi was fast enough for streaming. Sarah found their concerns oddly comforting. Their problems were solvable. Their stress was temporary. None of them had ever watched a friend bleed out in a desert while waiting for extraction that might never come. She had chosen the apartment on the 4th floor specifically because it offered clear sightlines in 3 directions and had 2 separate exit routes. The lease agreement listed her occupation as food service worker, her emergency contact as her sister in California, and her previous address as a motel in San Diego, where she had stayed for 3 weeks while processing out of the military. Everything on the application was technically true, but it revealed nothing about who she really was or what she was capable of. The Honda Civic was equally unremarkable. A 2018 model in gray that blended into traffic without attracting attention. She had paid cash for it from a dealer in Tacoma, choosing reliability over performance. The backseat held a gym bag with workout clothes and a first aid kit that contained more supplies than most people would consider necessary. The glove compartment held registration papers, insurance documents, and a tire pressure gauge. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would draw interest from a casual observer. What they wouldn't find, even if they searched carefully, was any indication that Sarah Martinez had been trained to survive in environments where survival wasn't guaranteed. That she could navigate by stars, start a fire in wet conditions, or treat gunshot wounds with whatever materials were available. That she had completed missions in 3 different countries that would never be publicly acknowledged. That she had earned the respect of men who initially doubted whether any woman belonged in their ranks. The evening routine had become sacred to her. Stop at the bodega for whatever groceries she needed. Park in the same space she had been assigned when she signed the lease. Take the elevator to the 4th floor. Lock the door behind her. Heat up dinner while listening to a podcast about true crime or history. Read for an hour before bed. Sleep without dreams, or at least without the dreams that had haunted her first months out of the service. Tonight's groceries consisted of ingredients for pasta with marinara sauce, a bag of apples, and a carton of almond milk. Simple food that required minimal preparation. She had learned to find satisfaction in tasks that would have bored her to tears during her military years. There was peace in chopping vegetables, in measuring pasta, in the predictable process of turning ingredients into a meal. It was the opposite of everything she had been trained for, and that made it valuable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bodega owner, an elderly man named Hassan, had become something approaching a friend over the months she had lived in the neighborhood. He never asked personal questions, but he remembered that she preferred green apples to red ones and that she always bought the same brand of coffee. Their conversations were limited to observations about the weather and complaints about the city's construction projects, but there was comfort in the routine. Hassan represented stability in a way that felt foreign to someone who had spent years moving from base to base, mission to mission. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket as she reached for her car door handle. A text from her sister asking about Thanksgiving plans. The kind of normal family communication that still felt surreal after years of operational security that had prevented her from maintaining regular contact with anyone outside her unit. She would respond later when she was settled in her apartment, with a cup of tea and the mental space to think about holidays and family obligations. The parking garage was quieter tonight than usual. Most residents were home by now, their workdays finished, their evening routines already in progress. The building held teachers and accountants, graduate students, and nonprofit workers. People who worried about deadlines and rent payments and whether their houseplants were getting enough sunlight. People whose greatest dangers were rush hour traffic and expired milk in the refrigerator. Sarah appreciated their innocence without envying it. She had seen too much to ever return to that kind of simplicity, but she could protect it by choosing to live quietly among them, by being the neighbor who picked up packages when people were traveling, by keeping her past buried so deeply that it couldn't disturb their peaceful assumptions about the world. The keys felt familiar in her hand as she approached the driver's side door. The same motion she had completed hundreds of times since moving to Portland. The same sequence of actions that marked the transition from public space to private space. From the external world to the controlled environment of her apartment. Tonight, though, her subconscious was processing information that her conscious mind hadn't yet identified. Footsteps that didn't match the normal patterns of residents heading home from work. Shadows that fell at angles inconsistent with the overhead lighting. The subtle sound of voices pitched low enough to avoid being overheard. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would alarm an ordinary person. Just the kind of environmental changes that had once meant the difference between completing a mission and becoming a casualty. Sarah's hand paused on the door handle as her training automatically kicked in. Not panic, not fear. Just the calm assessment of a situation that might be developing into something that required attention. She had spent years learning to trust her instincts, even when they couldn't be immediately verified. Especially when they couldn't be immediately verified. The Honda Civic was parked with its front end facing toward the exit ramp, a habit she had developed without conscious thought. The spacing between vehicles was adequate for maneuvering if movement became necessary. The concrete pillar to her left provided cover if cover became relevant. The stairwell door was 30 feet away, the emergency exit 45 feet in the opposite direction. Her peripheral vision caught movement between the vehicles parked 2 rows over. 3 figures moving with purpose, but without urgency. 2 coordinated to be residents heading to their cars. 2 focused to be lost or confused. Sarah's breathing remained steady as her mind processed possibilities. Random crime was always possible in an urban environment. Mistaken identity. Wrong place, wrong time. Or something more specific. The grocery bag remained tucked under her arm as she pretended to fumble with her keys, buying time to gather more information. The movement patterns of the 3 figures suggested coordination. They were spacing themselves to cover multiple angles. One moving to block the exit ramp. One positioning himself between her location and the stairwell. One approaching directly but using the parked cars as concealment. Sarah's heart rate increased by exactly the amount her training had taught her was optimal for performance under stress, not enough to compromise fine motor skills. Not so little as to miss the surge of adrenaline that would enhance reaction time and sensory processing. Her body was automatically preparing for possibilities her mind was still evaluating. The figures were close enough now for her to assess them more accurately. 3 men, probably in their 20s or early 30s. Dressed in dark clothing that didn't quite constitute a uniform but suggested coordination. Moving with confidence that indicated this wasn't their first time working together. The one approaching directly was larger than the other 2, probably. Used to relying on physical intimidation to achieve his goals. They were still 30 seconds away from reaching her position, but their movement patterns indicated they weren't planning to simply walk past. The spacing was too deliberate, the timing too synchronized. Sarah's options began to crystallize with the clarity that came from years of training in tactical decision-making. Run toward the exit ramp and encounter the man positioned to block that route. Move toward the stairwell and engage the second man while the other 2 closed from behind. Stand her ground at the car and allow them to dictate the terms of whatever confrontation they were planning. Or create a 4th option that none of them would expect. The grocery bag contained a jar of marinara sauce, 3 apples, a box of pasta, and a carton of almond milk. Improvised weapons if necessary, though she hoped it wouldn't come to that. Her keys were positioned correctly for use as a striking tool. Her phone was in her back pocket, but calling for help would take time they probably wouldn't give her. Sarah's body remained relaxed and natural as her mind calculated angles and distances. The approaching men couldn't know that she was assessing their formation for weaknesses. They couldn't see that she was automatically identifying which one represented the primary threat and which two were supporting players. They had chosen their target based on assumptions that were about to prove catastrophically wrong. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh, institutional light that eliminated subtlety from the scene developing below. The parking garage had become a stage set for something that would be over quickly, one way or another. Sarah felt the familiar calm that came before action, the mental clarity that had carried her through missions where hesitation meant failure. And failure meant people didn't come home. Her reflection in the car window showed a woman in jeans and a hoodie, carrying groceries and keys, looking like any other resident heading home after a long day. The reflection didn't reveal the scars from shrapnel wounds or the muscle memory that could turn ordinary objects into effective weapons. It didn't show the tactical training that had been drilled into her until it became as automatic as breathing. The 3 men were 20 seconds away now, their coordination becoming more obvious as they closed the distance. Sarah could see that they had done this before, probably many times. They moved with the confidence of predators who had learned to read victims accurately, who knew how to use intimidation and positioning to achieve their goals without unnecessary violence. They were expecting compliance, fear, confusion. They were expecting a normal person to freeze or flee or beg. They were expecting someone who had lived a normal life and learned normal responses to abnormal situations. They were expecting a target who would be overwhelmed by the sudden shift from routine to crisis. Sarah Martinez was not a normal person. She had been forged in environments where normal people couldn't survive. She had been trained by instructors who understood that the difference between elite warriors and everyone else wasn't physical strength or weapons expertise. It was the ability to remain calm when chaos erupted, to think clearly when others panicked, to act decisively when action was required. The grocery bag shifted slightly against her ribs as she adjusted her stance without appearing to do so. Her weight distribution became more balanced, her center of gravity lowered by degrees too small for casual observation. Her grip on the keys tightened just enough to ensure they wouldn't slip when she needed them. The parking garage held its breath around them, concrete and metal in fluorescent light, creating an arena where the next 21 seconds would determine who walked away and who didn't. Sarah felt the familiar peace that came with accepting whatever was about to happen. She had been here before, in different places under different circumstances, but the feeling was always the same. Time slowed as the first man stepped into the light between 2 parked cars, his face visible for the first time. Sarah looked at him and saw someone who had never encountered real resistance. Someone who had learned to take what he wanted through intimidation and superior numbers. Someone who was about to discover that not all targets were created equal. The second man moved to cut off her retreat to the stairwell, his position calculated to create psychological pressure. The third man held his position near the exit ramp, ensuring that if she tried to run, she would be running toward him rather than away from the threat. It was a solid tactical formation for controlling a civilian target. It was also about to become their first and last mistake. Sarah's breathing remained steady as the final 10 seconds ticked away. She had been in worse situations with higher stakes and less preparation time. She had faced trained soldiers who wanted to kill her, not street criminals who probably just wanted her wallet and car keys. This was actually easier than some Tuesday afternoons she remembered from her deployment years. The difference was that tonight she was protecting only herself. No team to worry about. No mission parameters to consider. No rules of engagement beyond the simple mathematics of violence that she had learned in places where mathematics was the difference between going home and going home in a box. The first man opened his mouth to speak, probably to deliver whatever line he used to establish control over his victims. Sarah waited, patient as a predator, calm as a professional, ready as someone who had spent years preparing for moments exactly like this one. 21 seconds. That's how long it would take for 3 men to learn that they had chosen the wrong victim. That's how long it would take for Sarah Martinez to remind herself why she had earned the right to wear the trident that now hung in a frame in her bedroom closet. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in stark relief. The concrete walls waited to echo whatever sounds were about to fill the space. The parking garage held its breath as ordinary routine transformed into something that would be over almost before it began. Sarah Martinez stood next to her Honda Civic, grocery bag under her arm, keys in her hand, looking like every target these men had chosen before. Looking like someone who would be easy to intimidate, easy to control, easy to victimize. They were about to learn otherwise. The first man cleared his throat with the artificial confidence of someone who had performed this routine dozens of times before. Marcus Thompson was 28 years old and had been running variations of this scam for 3 years without encountering serious resistance. His partners, Danny and Kyle, flanked Sarah's position with the casual precision of a crew that had learned to work together through repetition rather than training. "Evening, miss," Marcus said, his voice carrying the false friendliness that predators use to establish psychological control. "Nice car you got there. Bet it runs real smooth." Sarah's expression remained neutral as she processed the opening gambit. Standard intimidation tactics designed to create confusion and establish dominance. The compliment about her vehicle was meant to suggest they were interested in more than casual conversation. The positioning of his partners communicated that resistance would be futile. Everything about their approach suggested they had used this formula successfully before. Marcus took another step closer, his hands visible but positioned where they could move quickly if needed. "We're having some car trouble ourselves. Dead battery. You wouldn't happen to have jumper cables, would you?" The request was obviously fabricated, but it served multiple purposes. It gave them a reason to approach her vehicle. It created an opportunity for them to separate her from potential witnesses. It established a pretext for their presence that would sound reasonable to anyone who overheard fragments of conversation. Sarah recognized the technique as effective against targets who weren't trained to identify deception. "Sorry," she replied, her tone pleasant but unrevealing. "I don't carry cables." Danny shifted his weight slightly, a motion that brought him 2 steps closer to the stairwell door, while maintaining the appearance of casual movement. He was the smallest of the 3 men, probably selected for this crew because his less intimidating appearance helped disarm potential victims. His role was to block escape routes while his partners handled the direct confrontation. Kyle remained near the exit ramp, his position unchanged, but his attention clearly focused on Sarah's location. He was larger than Danny but smaller than Marcus, probably the crew's specialist in handling complications. If someone tried to run, Kyle would intercept them. If someone tried to fight, Kyle would provide backup. His presence was insurance against scenarios that didn't go according to plan. "That's unfortunate," Marcus continued, his smile becoming less friendly and more predatory, "because we really need some help here. And you look like someone who might be able to assist us with more than just car trouble." The threat was becoming explicit now, though still couched in language that maintained plausible deniability. Sarah's peripheral vision tracked Danny's continued movement toward the stairwell while Kyle began a slow advance from the exit ramp. They were tightening the formation, reducing her options, applying pressure through positioning rather than overt aggression. Sarah's grip on her keys adjusted by millimeters, a change too subtle for untrained observers to notice. Her weight shifted almost imperceptibly onto the balls of her feet, improving her balance and reaction time. The grocery bag remained tucked against her side, but her free hand moved to a position where it could access the bag's contents if necessary. "I'm not sure what kind of help you're looking for," she said, maintaining the fiction that this might still be a misunderstanding. "But I'm just trying to get home." Marcus laughed, the sound echoing off the concrete walls with artificial warmth. "Oh, we understand completely. Long day at work, looking forward to getting inside, maybe watching some TV and relaxing. We've all been there." The false empathy was designed to lower her guard, while simultaneously demonstrating that they had been watching her, that they knew her routines, that this encounter wasn't random. Sarah processed this information without allowing it to show on her face. If they had been conducting surveillance, they would have observed her going to work, coming home, shopping for groceries. They would have concluded she was an ideal target. Danny reached his position near the stairwell door, his movement complete and his attention now fully focused on Sarah's location. The formation was locked in place. 3 points of a triangle with Sarah at the center, each man positioned to prevent escape in a different direction. They had reduced her options to compliance or confrontation. "The thing is," Marcus continued, his tone becoming more conversational as their tactical advantage solidified, "we're having some financial difficulties ourselves. Bills to pay, obligations to meet. You know how it is." Kyle began his final approach from the exit ramp, no longer bothering to conceal his movement behind the pretense of casual walking. His steps were measured and deliberate, designed to communicate inevitability rather than urgency. The message was clear: resistance would only make things worse. Sarah's training automatically cataloged the changing dynamics. Marcus was the talker, probably the leader, definitely the one who would escalate to violence if psychological pressure failed. Danny was the blocker, positioned to prevent retreat, but probably not expecting to engage directly. Kyle was the enforcer, larger and more aggressive, moving to provide intimidation and backup force. "I understand financial pressure," Sarah replied, her voice remaining calm despite the closing triangle of threats. "But I don't see how I can help with that." Marcus's smile disappeared completely, replaced by the cold expression of someone who had decided that politeness was no longer necessary. "Oh, I think you do. See, we know you work at that coffee shop. We know you live alone in this building. We know you don't have a boyfriend coming home tonight." The surveillance had been more extensive than she had initially calculated. They had invested time in learning her patterns, her vulnerabilities, her isolation. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a planned operation based on reconnaissance and preparation. Sarah felt a flicker of professional respect for their thoroughness, even as she prepared to dismantle their plan. Danny produced a knife from his jacket pocket, the blade catching the fluorescent light as he held it low and visible. Not threatening her directly, just ensuring she understood that they were prepared to use violence if psychological pressure wasn't sufficient. The weapon was a cheap folding knife, probably selected for intimidation value rather than combat. Effectiveness. "We're not unreasonable people," Marcus said, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining simple facts to a slow student. "We just need you to empty your pockets, hand over your car keys, and maybe take a little drive with us to an ATM." Kyle was 10 feet away now, close enough to reach her in 2 strides if she tried to run. His hands were empty but ready, positioned where they could grab or strike depending on her response. His eyes held the flat confidence of someone who had never encountered effective resistance from a female target. Sarah's breathing remained steady as she calculated angles and timing. Marcus was 7 feet away, still talking but ready to move. Danny was blocking the stairwell but had positioned himself poorly for quick engagement. Kyle was the immediate physical threat, but his approach angle left him exposed to counterattack. "I don't carry much cash," she said, continuing to play for time while her subconscious processed tactical options. "And my ATM card has daily limits." Marcus nodded as if this was reasonable concern. "We'll work with whatever you've got. The important thing is that everyone stays calm and nobody gets hurt." The implicit threat was becoming explicit. Compliance would result in robbery and probably worse. Resistance would result in immediate violence from three men who believed they held every advantage. They had trapped her in an isolated location with no witnesses and no immediate help available. What they didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had been trapped before, in places where the stakes were higher and the enemies more dangerous. She had learned to find opportunity in apparent disadvantage, to create options where none seemed to exist, to turn superior numbers against themselves through proper application of violence and timing. Kyle stepped closer, his presence intended to eliminate any remaining thoughts of resistance. "Let's start with the keys," he said, extending his hand with the casual expectation of compliance. "Nice and easy." Sarah looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Kyle was 6 feet tall and probably weighed 200 pounds. He had the build of someone who worked construction or warehouse jobs, strong from physical labor, but not trained in actual combat. His stance was confident, but unbalanced, his guard down because he didn't expect a 5'6" woman to present a serious threat. "The keys are right here," Sarah said, raising her hand slowly as if preparing to comply with his demand. Marcus relaxed slightly, interpreting her movement as submission. Danny shifted his attention toward her purse, probably calculating its contents and wondering if she carried additional valuables. Kyle stepped even closer, reaching for the keys with the careless confidence of someone who had never been effectively resisted. Sarah's hand moved with the precision of thousands of hours of training, the keys positioned between her fingers as her arm snapped forward in a short, devastating arc. The metal struck Kyle's throat just below his Adam's apple, targeting the soft tissue that protected his airway. The impact was controlled but brutal, designed to incapacitate rather than kill, but leaving no doubt about her capability. Kyle staggered backward, his hands instinctively rising to his throat as he struggled to breathe. The expression on his face shifted from confidence to confusion to pain in the space of seconds. He tried to speak but could only produce a strangled wheeze as his body processed the damage. Marcus reacted faster than Sarah had expected, lunging forward with his arms extended to grab her. But his movement was predictable, driven by anger rather than training, and she sidestepped his charge while driving her elbow into his ribs. The impact sent him stumbling into the side of her Honda Civic, his shoulder striking the passenger door with a sound that echoed through the parking garage. Danny moved toward her with his knife raised, but his approach was hesitant, uncertain. He had expected to intimidate a victim, not engage in actual combat with someone who clearly knew what she was doing. His grip on the weapon was wrong, his stance was wrong, his timing was wrong. Sarah grabbed the bag of groceries with her free hand and swung it in a short arc that connected with Danny's wrist. The jar of marinara sauce inside the bag struck the nerve cluster that controlled his grip, causing his fingers to open involuntarily. The knife clattered to the concrete floor as Danny stumbled backward, cradling his injured arm. Kyle was still gasping for air, his face beginning to turn red as his damaged throat restricted his breathing. Marcus pushed himself away from the car, his expression shifting from predatory confidence to genuine concern as he realized their carefully planned operation was falling apart. Danny backed toward the stairwell door, his weapon gone and his courage evaporating as he understood that their victim was not what she appeared to be. "What the hell?" Marcus wheezed, his ribs aching from the elbow strike. "What the hell are you?" Sarah didn't answer. She was already moving, her body flowing into the combat stance that had been drilled into her until it became automatic. Her feet were properly spaced, her center of gravity low, her hands positioned for offense or defense, depending on what the situation required. The transformation from apparent victim to clear predator was complete and terrifying. Kyle attempted to charge her again, his damaged throat producing only ragged breathing sounds, as he tried to overwhelm her through size and aggression. Sarah stepped into his advance rather than away from it, using his momentum against him as she drove her knee into his solar plexus. The impact folded him over and sent him crashing to the floor between two parked cars. Danny had reached the stairwell door and was fumbling with the handle, his injured wrist making it difficult to operate the mechanism. Panic was beginning to override his coordination as he realized that escape was more important than supporting his partners. The careful formation that had seemed so effective moments earlier was dissolving into chaos. Marcus backed away from Sarah, his hands raised in a gesture that was part defense and part surrender. "Look, lady, we don't want any trouble. We'll just leave, okay? No harm done." Sarah studied him with the cold assessment of someone evaluating a tactical situation. Marcus was the leader, the planner, probably the one who had selected her as a target and convinced the others to participate. He was also the most dangerous because he was still thinking instead of just reacting. "You're right," she said, her voice calm and conversational. "You don't want any trouble." The grocery bag was torn from her earlier movement, its contents scattered across the concrete floor. Apples rolled under nearby cars. The pasta box had split open, sending elbow macaroni in random directions. The jar of marinara sauce had cracked but not broken, leaving a red stain that looked ominous under the fluorescent lights. Kyle was attempting to stand, using the bumper of a parked car for support as his breathing slowly returned to normal. His throat would be sore for days, but the damage wasn't permanent. He looked at Sarah with new understanding, recognizing that she represented a level of danger he had never encountered before. Danny finally managed to open the stairwell door. But instead of fleeing, he hesitated. Professional criminals developed loyalty to their crews, and abandoning Marcus and Kyle would mark him as unreliable for future operations. He stood in the doorway, torn between self-preservation and obligation. "Your friend has the right idea," Sarah said, nodding toward Danny's position at the door. "This is a good time to leave." Marcus glanced between his injured partner and the woman who had systematically dismantled their carefully planned operation. The mathematics of the situation were clear. They had brought superior numbers and preparation. She had brought superior training and experience. The outcome was no longer in doubt. "We're going," Marcus said, his voice lacking the confidence it had carried minutes earlier. "Come on, Kyle. Danny, let's go." Kyle pushed himself away from the car, his movements careful and pained. He avoided eye contact with Sarah as he made his way toward the stairwell, his pride damaged more severely than his throat. The swagger that had characterized his approach was gone, replaced by the careful movements of someone who had learned not to underestimate his opponents. Danny held the door open as his partners approached, his eyes still fixed on Sarah with a mixture of fear and fascination. He had seen violence before, but never violence applied with such precision and control. She had hurt them without appearing angry, disabled them without seeming to exert herself. "Wait," Sarah said as Marcus reached the doorway. All three men froze, uncertain whether she was going to escalate the situation or allow them to leave. Marcus turned slowly, his expression guarded but attentive. Kyle and Danny remained ready to bolt through the door at the first sign of additional aggression. "Next time you're thinking about choosing a target," Sarah said, her tone conversational but carrying an undertone that made her meaning unmistakable, "make sure you know what you're getting into." Marcus nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged both her superiority and his understanding of the lesson. Then he turned and followed his partners through the stairwell door, leaving Sarah alone in the parking garage with the scattered remains of her groceries and the echoing silence of Fluorescent lights. The encounter had lasted exactly 87 seconds from first contact to final departure. Sarah's heart rate was elevated, but not racing. Her breathing was slightly accelerated but controlled. Her hands were steady as she bent to collect the undamaged items from her grocery bag. The jar of marinara sauce was cracked but still sealed. 2 of the apples were bruised but edible. The pasta box was destroyed, its contents scattered across oil-stained concrete. The almond milk carton was intact, its contents unaware of the violence that had swirled around them. Sarah gathered what could be salvaged and unlocked her car door. The Honda Civic was exactly as she had left it, unchanged by the events that had transformed its owner from apparent victim to demonstrated predator. She placed the remaining groceries on the passenger seat and started the engine. The drive to the 4th floor was routine and uneventful. The elevator was empty, its mirrored walls reflecting a woman who looked exactly as she had when she entered. The parking garage, no visible signs of the encounter. No evidence of the violence that had erupted and subsided in less than 2 minutes. Her apartment welcomed her with its familiar silence and carefully controlled environment. The deadbolt turned with its usual solid click. The chain lock engaged with its customary rattle. The alarm system accepted her code and shifted from armed to disarmed status. Sarah set the salvaged groceries on her kitchen counter and began the process of preparing dinner from what remained. The pasta was gone, but she had rice in the pantry. The marinara sauce was damaged, but she had olive oil and garlic. The routine of cooking would help process the adrenaline and return her nervous system to baseline. Outside her window, Portland continued its evening rhythm. Traffic moved through intersections. Pedestrians walked on sidewalks. Restaurants served dinner to customers who complained about prices and service. The normal world proceeded without awareness that 3 predators had just learned the difference between selecting victims and encountering warriors. Sarah's phone buzzed with another text from her sister, still asking about Thanksgiving plans. She would respond later when her hands were completely steady and her thoughts had fully returned to civilian concerns. For now, she focused on the simple task of preparing a meal from whatever ingredients had survived the evening's complications. The scars on her shoulder blades didn't ache tonight. The training that had been beaten into her through years of instruction and repetition had proven its value once again. She was home, safe, uninjured, and surrounded by the ordinary concerns of ordinary life. Tomorrow she would return to grind coffee and pull espresso shots for customers who would never know that their barista had reminded 3 criminals why some targets were better left alone. Tomorrow she would be Sarah Martinez, food service worker, quiet neighbor, unremarkable resident of a building full of people living unremarkable lives. Tonight, she was something else entirely. Tonight, she was exactly what she had been trained to be. The silence that followed the stairwell door closing felt different from the ordinary quiet that usually filled the parking garage at this hour. Sarah stood beside her Honda Civic, keys still gripped between her fingers, listening to the buildings settle around her. The fluorescent lights continued their steady hum, casting the same harsh shadows they always did, but the space felt charged with residual energy from what had just occurred. She walked slowly around the perimeter of where the confrontation had taken place, her trained eyes cataloging details that most people would never notice. Scuff marks on the concrete where Kyle had fallen. A small smear of blood near the passenger door of her car where Marcus had struck his shoulder. The scattered pasta pieces that would need to be cleaned up before they attracted rodents or drew attention from building maintenance. The knife Danny had dropped lay between 2 parking spaces, its cheap metal blade reflecting the overhead lighting. Sarah studied it without touching it, noting the brand and style. A basic folding knife purchased at a gas station or convenience store, the kind of weapon chosen by someone who wanted intimidation value, without the legal complications of carrying something more serious. It told her these men were criminals of opportunity rather than professional predators. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown local number. Sarah stared at the screen for a moment before declining the call. It could be legitimate, a wrong number, or a telemarketer working late hours. It could also be connected to what had just happened. She made a mental note to monitor for additional calls from unfamiliar numbers over the next few days. The parking garages. Security camera had recorded everything, she realized. The building management would have video footage of the entire encounter, from the initial approach by the three men to their hasty departure through the stairwell. Sarah considered the implications of this as she gathered the last of the scattered groceries. The footage would clearly show her acting in self-defense, but it would also demonstrate capabilities that might raise questions she preferred not to answer. Building security was handled by a private company that employed mostly retired police officers and former military personnel. They would recognize professional training when they saw it. They might wonder why a coffee shop employee moved like someone with extensive combat experience. They might ask questions about her background that she wasn't prepared to answer truthfully. Sarah picked up the fallen knife using the edge of her jacket, careful not to leave fingerprints on the handle. She would dispose of it properly, ensuring it couldn't be traced back to tonight's events or used in future crimes by its original owner. The weapon disappeared into her jacket pocket as she finished collecting the remains of her groceries. The elevator ride to the 4th floor gave her time to consider her options. She could report the attempted robbery to the police, providing a factual account of what had occurred while omitting certain details about her background and training. She could speak with building management about security improvements, suggesting additional cameras or patrol schedules without revealing why she was qualified to make such recommendations. She could do nothing at all, treating the encounter as an isolated incident that required no follow-up action. Each option carried risks and benefits that she evaluated with the systematic thoroughness her military training had ingrained. Involving the police would create an official record that might attract unwanted attention to her civilian identity. Speaking with building management might improve security for other residents, but could also raise questions about her expertise in such matters. Doing nothing preserved her anonymity, but left the possibility that the three men might target other residents or return for a second attempt. Her apartment door opened to the familiar sanctuary of controlled space and carefully arranged possessions. The deadbolt engaged with its reassuring click, followed by the chain lock and the activation of her personal security system. Only then did Sarah allow herself to acknowledge the full scope of what had just occurred and what it might mean for the careful life she had constructed in Portland. She placed the salvaged groceries on her kitchen counter and began preparing dinner with mechanical precision. Rice instead of pasta, olive oil, and garlic instead of marinara sauce, the remaining apples sliced and arranged on a plate. The routine of cooking helped her process the adrenaline that was still circulating through her system, even though the immediate threat had passed. The encounter in the parking garage had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it had shattered months of careful anonymity. 3 strangers now knew that Sarah Martinez was not who she appeared to be. They had experienced firsthand the difference between targeting a victim and confronting someone trained for violence. The question was whether they would keep that knowledge to themselves or share it with others. Marcus had demonstrated leadership and planning capabilities during their approach. He wouldn't abandon his criminal career because of one failed operation, but he might avoid targeting women who lived alone in secure buildings. Kyle had shown himself to be primarily muscle, following orders rather than making decisions. His damaged throat would heal, but his confidence in intimidating female victims might not recover as quickly. Danny appeared to be the least committed member of the group, the one most likely to reconsider his association with the others after experiencing effective resistance. Sarah's phone rang again, this time displaying her sister's contact information. She answered on the 3rd ring, forcing her voice to sound normal and relaxed despite the circumstances. "Hey Maria, "Sorry I missed your text earlier. Just got home from work." Her sister's voice carried the familiar warmth of family conversation, discussing holiday plans and mutual friends, and the ordinary concerns of people whose biggest challenges involved scheduling conflicts and dietary restrictions. Sarah found herself grateful for the normalcy of the conversation, the reminder that most people lived lives uncontaminated by violence or the constant assessment of potential threats. "You sound tired," Maria observed during a pause in their discussion of Thanksgiving menus. "Everything okay up there in the rainy city?" Sarah stirred the rice on her stove and considered how to answer honestly without revealing anything important. "Just a long day. Nothing that won't be better tomorrow." They talked for another 15 minutes about family gossip and shared memories, the kind of conversation that anchored Sarah to a world beyond tactical considerations and operational security. When they finally hung up, she felt more connected to her civilian identity and less consumed by the professional reflexes that had dominated her thinking since the parking garage encounter. The rice was perfectly cooked, the olive oil and garlic providing simple flavors that required no complex preparation. Sarah ate slowly, savoring both the food and the quiet of her apartment. Outside her window, Portland continued its evening rhythm, unaware that 3 criminals were probably discussing their failed operation and reconsidering their career choices. Her laptop sat open on the small dining table, its screen displaying the news website she had been reading before leaving for the grocery store. International incidents, political disagreements, economic reports, and weather forecasts filled the page with information about events that would affect millions of people. None of the headlines mentioned failed robberies in downtown parking garages or the brief intersection of criminal ambition with military training. Sarah closed the laptop and moved to her bedroom, where the day's work clothes were replaced with comfortable pajamas and thick socks. The ritual of changing into sleepwear marked the transition from public persona to private self, from the careful performance of normalcy to the authentic relaxation of solitude. The framed Navy SEAL trident sat on her dresser, its golden surface reflecting the bedroom's soft lighting. She had earned the right to wear that insignia through trials that had broken stronger candidates, through training that had tested every aspect of her physical and mental capabilities, through missions that had required her to function effectively when failure meant death for herself and others. Tonight's encounter in the parking garage hadn't required the full spectrum of her capabilities. 3 untrained criminals posed no real threat to someone who had survived combat operations in hostile territory. But the incident served as a reminder that her past was always present, waiting beneath the surface of her carefully constructed civilian life. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed and allowed herself to fully process what had occurred. Not the tactical details, which she had analyzed automatically during and immediately after the encounter, but the emotional implications of being forced back into a mindset she had worked months to leave behind. The transition from military to civilian life was supposed to be complete by now. She was supposed to be Sarah Martinez, coffee shop employee, unremarkable resident of a quiet apartment building. She was supposed to worry about customer complaints and apartment rent, and whether she had enough groceries for the week. She wasn't supposed to be analyzing criminal behavior patterns or evaluating building security vulnerabilities or considering the tactical implications of security camera footage. But the encounter had demonstrated that her military identity wasn't something she could simply discard like an old uniform. It was woven into her reflexes, her assessment patterns, her automatic responses to threat situations. She could choose not to think like a warrior, but when circumstances required it, that training would emerge whether she wanted it to or not. The phone rang again, and this time Sarah checked the caller ID before answering. Derek from the coffee shop, probably calling about tomorrow's schedule or some problem with the evening cleanup. She answered with the cheerful professionalism that customers expected and coworkers appreciated. "Sarah, hey, sorry to call so late. We had a equipment malfunction with the espresso machine, and I might need you to come in early tomorrow to help deal with the repair tech. I know it's short notice." She found herself grateful for the mundane problem, the ordinary workplace crisis that required nothing more dangerous than diagnostic skills and customer service patience. "No problem, Derek. What time do you need me there?" 7:30 instead of 8? I'll comp you for the extra time, obviously. And I'll pick up coffee and pastries from the place down the street, so we don't have to deal with disappointed customers if the repair takes longer than expected." Sarah agreed to the earlier schedule and listened to Derek explain the technical details of the espresso machine failure with the focused attention she normally reserved for mission briefings. When they hung up, she realized that tomorrow would provide exactly what she needed, a return to routine responsibilities that had nothing to do with violence or tactical considerations. She set her alarm for 6:15 instead of 6:45, allowing extra time for the earlier commute. The coffee shop would be full of customers who wanted their morning caffeine fix and had no idea that their barista had spent the evening dealing with criminal predators. They would complain about foam density and flavor profiles while she pulled shots and steamed milk, their biggest concern centered on beverage quality and service speed. The shower helped wash away the residual tension from the evening's events, hot water and familiar soap restoring the sense of normalcy that had been disrupted by the parking garage encounter. Sarah stood under the spray longer than usual, letting the heat penetrate muscles that had been coiled with readiness even after the threat had passed. When she emerged from the bathroom, her apartment felt completely secure again. The deadbolt was engaged, the chain lock was in place, the security system was active. The windows were locked, the blinds were closed, the environment was controlled and predictable. She was safe in a space that belonged entirely to her, surrounded by possessions that reflected her chosen identity rather than her military past. The book on her nightstand was a mystery novel she had been reading in small increments over the past week, a story about ordinary people solving extraordinary problems through intelligence and persistence rather than violence. Sarah read 3 chapters before her eyes began to feel heavy, the familiar characters and predictable plot structure, providing exactly the kind of mental distraction she needed. Sleep came easily despite the evening's excitement, her body recognizing that the threat had passed and allowing her nervous system to return to baseline. She dreamed about espresso machines and customer orders, about steaming milk and balancing cash registers, about the mundane concerns of food service work that would fill tomorrow's hours. The alarm at 6:15 brought her back to consciousness. With its gentle insistence, the sound mixing with early morning traffic and the distant hum of the building's heating system. Sarah woke feeling rested and centered, ready to return to the routine that had become her anchor in civilian life. The coffee shop uniform hung ready in her closet, clean and pressed and completely unremarkable. Black pants, white shirt, green apron with the shop's logo embroidered across the chest. The clothes of someone whose biggest challenge would be remembering customer preferences and maintaining equipment that occasionally malfunctioned. Sarah dressed with the same systematic efficiency she brought to all routine tasks, each movement deliberate and economical. The person who had disabled 3 criminals in a parking garage was filing herself away until circumstances required her return. The person who would spend the day serving coffee and handling customer complaints was taking her place, ready to perform a role that had become increasingly natural over the months since her discharge. The Honda Civic started reliably in the parking garage that now held additional significance beyond simple transportation access. The space where the encounter had occurred showed no visible signs of what had transpired there. Maintenance had probably cleaned up the scattered pasta, and the scuff marks on the concrete were invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Sarah drove through Portland's early morning streets with the radio playing softly, traffic reports mixing with music and weather forecasts to create the soundtrack of ordinary commuting. She passed joggers beginning their daily runs, dog walkers fulfilling their pets' morning routines, coffee shops opening their doors to serve customers who valued caffeine more than sleep. The city looked exactly as it had the day before, unchanged. By the brief intersection of criminal intent and military training that had occurred in a concrete parking garage, Portland continued to be the quiet, rainy place where people could reinvent themselves without explaining their past, where former warriors could serve coffee and former criminals could presumably reconsider their career choices. Grind Coffee occupied a corner location with large windows that let in natural light and provided clear views of the surrounding neighborhood. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, as was her habit, and used the extra time to prepare for the repair technicians' visit and the disruption it would create to normal operations. Derek was already there, his usual energy slightly diminished by the stress of equipment failure and schedule disruption. He looked relieved when Sarah walked through the back door, his faith in her competence evident in the way his shoulders relaxed slightly. "The repair guy should be here by 8, he explained while Sarah checked the cash registers and prepared the backup brewing equipment. "If we can get the espresso machine working by 9, we might avoid losing too many customers." To the place across the street, Sarah nodded and began the routine tasks that would keep the shop running, even with reduced capabilities. Brewing coffee in thermal carafes, preparing simple drinks that didn't require espresso, arranging pastries and breakfast items in the display case. The familiar work helped complete her transition back to civilian identity, each ordinary task reinforcing her chosen role as someone whose concerns were professional rather than tactical. The first customers arrived at 7:45, regular patrons who understood that equipment sometimes failed and were willing to accept modified service as long as they could get some form of caffeinated beverage. Sarah served them with the cheerful efficiency they expected, her movements automatic and precise as she fulfilled orders and operated equipment. The repair technician arrived exactly on schedule, a middle-aged man with professional credentials and diagnostic equipment, who approached the malfunctioning espresso machine with the systematic methodology that Sarah recognized from her own approach to complex problems. She watched him work while serving customers, noting the logical progression of his troubleshooting process. By 9:15, the espresso machine was functioning normally again, its mechanical problems resolved. Through expert intervention and proper parts replacement, Sarah resumed her full range of beverage preparation, pulling shots and steaming milk for customers who had waited patiently or returned after being told to check back later. Derek's relief was visible as normal operations resumed and the shop returned to its usual rhythm of customers ordering complex drinks and employees fulfilling those orders with practiced skill. The morning crisis had passed, resolved through competence and persistence rather than drama or conflict. "You're a lifesaver," Derek told Sarah during a brief lull between customer rushes. "I don't know how I'd manage this place without reliable people like you." Sarah smiled and accepted the compliment without revealing that crisis management was among her most developed professional skills. Derek saw an employee who had shown up early and worked efficiently under difficult circumstances. He didn't see someone whose training had prepared her for challenges far more complex than malfunctioning coffee equipment. The day proceeded with its normal complement of regular customers and occasional new faces, people seeking caffeine and conversation in equal measure. Sarah pulled shots and crafted foam art, recommended pastries and processed payments, engaged in the brief social interactions that made customer service work both challenging and rewarding. None of the customers knew that their barista had spent the previous evening demonstrating why certain targets were better left alone. None of them suspected that the woman who remembered their drink preferences and asked about their weekend plans was someone who had earned the right to wear insignia that represented elite military training and operational experience. The afternoon shift arrived on schedule, allowing Sarah to complete her workday and return to her apartment with the satisfaction of having handled both criminal predators and equipment malfunctions with equal competence. The ordinary problems of civilian life were proving as manageable as the extraordinary challenges of military service, though they required different skills and produced different kinds of satisfaction. Portland's evening traffic moved at its usual pace as Sarah drove home, the radio providing background noise for thoughts that were beginning to settle into their normal patterns. The parking garage encounter was becoming part of her past rather than her immediate present, another experience to be processed and filed away with all the others that had shaped her into who she was. The Honda Civic returned to its assigned space in the building's parking garage, the same location where 3 criminals had learned an important lesson about target selection. Sarah gathered her purse and jacket and walked toward the elevator with the casual confidence of someone who belonged in this space and had every right to feel safe there. Her reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls showed a woman in coffee shop uniform returning home from an honest day's work. No visible signs of the warrior who had emerged when circumstances required her presence. No indication that Sarah Martinez was anything other than what she appeared to be, an ordinary resident of an ordinary building living an ordinary life in a city that welcomed people who preferred their past to remain private. The apartment welcomed her with its familiar silence and carefully maintained security. The deadbolt engaged with its solid click, the chain lock rattled into place, the alarm system accepted her code and shifted from armed to disarmed status. She was home, safe, surrounded by the possessions and routines that defined her chosen identity. Tomorrow would bring another shift at the coffee shop, more customers seeking caffeine and conversation, more opportunities to practice the skills of civilian life that she was still learning to value. The encounter with 3 criminals was over, resolved through decisive action and proper application of training that she hoped never to need again. But the training would remain, waiting beneath the surface of her carefully constructed normalcy, ready to emerge if circumstances ever again required the warrior to take precedence over the barista. Sarah Martinez had learned to live with both identities, accepting that she would always be more than she appeared, while choosing to be exactly what her neighbors needed: a quiet, reliable presence in a building full of people living quiet, reliable lives. 3 weeks after the parking garage incident, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at Grind Coffee. She was in the middle of the morning rush, steam wand hissing as she crafted a cappuccino for a regular customer, when she noticed a woman in her 50s standing near the counter with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to waiting. The woman wore a well-tailored business suit and carried herself with the confident posture that Sarah recognized from years of military service. When their eyes met, the stranger offered a subtle nod that conveyed both respect and recognition. Sarah finished the cappuccino and handed it to her customer before approaching the woman who had been watching her work. "Sarah Martinez?" the woman asked quietly, her voice carrying the controlled tone of someone accustomed to sensitive conversations. "Yes, can I help you?" "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, retired. I work as a security consultant for residential properties in the Portland area. I was wondering if we could speak privately when you have a break." Sarah felt her carefully constructed civilian routine shift slightly as military protocols reasserted themselves. She glanced at Derek, who was handling the register, then back at the woman who clearly knew more about her background than any customer should. "I have 15 minutes at 10:30, Sarah replied, her voice neutral but attentive. Hayes nodded and selected a corner table where she could observe the coffee shop's operations while remaining out of earshot of other customers. She ordered a black coffee and a blueberry muffin, paying with exact change and settling in to wait with the discipline of someone accustomed to surveillance and patience. Sarah completed the morning rush with her usual efficiency, but her awareness was heightened in ways that reminded her of operational environments. Hayes was obviously military or former military, probably officer rank based on her bearing and Confidence. Her presence at the coffee shop couldn't be coincidental, which meant she was here because of what had happened in the parking garage. At exactly 10:30, Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee and joined Hayes at the corner table. Derek waved from behind the counter, indicating he could handle things alone for a few minutes. The coffee shop had settled into its mid-morning lull, with only a few customers working on laptops or reading newspapers. You handled that situation in your building's parking garage with remarkable restraint. Hayes began without preamble. 3 criminals attempted to rob you, and all 3 walked away with minor injuries and a clear understanding that they had chosen the wrong target. Sarah sipped her coffee and waited for Hayes to explain how she knew about an incident that hadn't been reported to police or discussed with anyone outside the building management. I review security footage for several residential properties in downtown Portland, Hayes continued. Your building's management company contracted me to evaluate their current security measures and recommend improvements. When I reviewed the footage from 3 weeks ago, I saw something that interested me professionally. The explanation made sense from an operational standpoint. Building security companies would naturally review camera footage when evaluating vulnerabilities and developing recommendations. What didn't make sense was why a security consultant would seek out a coffee shop employee to discuss what she had observed. I'm not sure what you think you saw, Sarah replied carefully, but I was just defending myself against some criminals who picked the wrong target. Hayes smiled with the understanding expression of someone who recognized professional deflection. I saw a woman with extensive combat training neutralize 3 threats using minimal force and maximum efficiency. I saw someone who assessed tactical situations, controlled engagement distances, and applied violence with surgical precision. Sarah maintained her neutral expression while calculating how much Hayes actually knew versus how much she was inferring from the security footage. The conversation was moving into territory that required careful navigation. I saw someone, Hayes continued, who had been trained by the best instructors in the world to handle exactly this type of situation. Someone who had learned to remain calm under pressure, to think tactically under stress, and to apply force in measured increments rather than emotional responses. The coffee shop's background noise provided cover for their conversation, but Sarah remained aware that they were discussing sensitive topics in a public space. Hayes seemed equally conscious of operational security, keeping her voice low and her language general enough to avoid revealing specific details. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because I think you might be interested in some consulting work that would make better use of your actual qualifications," Hayes replied. "I work with several property management companies that need security assessments and training programs. The kind of work that requires someone who understands threats from a practical rather than theoretical perspective." The offer was unexpected but not entirely surprising. Sarah had known that her civilian cover couldn't remain perfect indefinitely, especially if she continued to encounter situations that required her military training. The question was whether accepting Hayes's offer would compromise the anonymity she had worked to establish. "I like working here," Sarah said, glancing around the coffee shop where Derek was teaching a new employee how to operate the espresso machine. "It's simple, predictable, no one gets hurt." Hayes nodded with understanding. "I imagine the transition to civilian life has been challenging. Going from environments where your skills were essential to survival to places where those same skills have to be carefully hidden." Sarah studied the older woman's face, noting the confidence and competence that came from years of military service and the subsequent transition to private sector work. Hayes represented a possible future, a way to use her training in civilian contexts without completely abandoning everything she had learned. "What kind of consulting work?" Sarah asked. "Security assessments for residential and commercial properties, training programs for security personnel, threat evaluation and response planning, The kind of work that requires someone who understands how predators think and how targets can protect themselves. The offer appealed to Sarah's professional instincts while addressing her need to remain useful without returning to active military service. Security consulting would allow her to help people protect themselves while maintaining the low profile that civilian life required. "I'd want to continue working here part-time," Sarah said. "This job provides cover and normalcy that I'm not ready to give up completely." Hayes smiled and pulled a business card from her jacket pocket. "I think that could be arranged. Most of my work is project-based anyway. A few days here, a week there, depending on client needs." Sarah accepted the card and studied the simple design. Patricia Hayes, Security Consulting, followed by a phone number and email address. No corporate logos, no indication of military background. Nothing that would attract unwanted attention. "Think about it," Hayes said, standing and gathering her purse. "When you're ready to do more than serve coffee, give me a call." After Hayes left, Sarah returned to the counter where Derek was struggling to explain foam techniques to the new employee. She took over the training session with the patience and systematic approach that had made her an effective instructor during her military years, breaking down complex skills into manageable components. "You're really good at teaching," Derek observed later during the lunch lull. "Have you ever thought about doing training programs or something like that?" Sarah smiled at the coincidence. "Maybe someday. For now, I'm happy here." That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment with Hayes' business card on the dining table beside her laptop. She had researched the security consulting company and found a legitimate business with positive reviews and an impressive client list. Hayes appeared to be exactly what she claimed, a former military officer who had successfully transitioned to civilian security work. The opportunity represented a chance to use her training in constructive ways while maintaining her civilian identity. Security consulting would allow her to help people protect themselves without the operational requirements of active duty service. She could teach others how to recognize threats and respond effectively without having to carry weapons or operate in hostile territory. Sarah picked up her phone and dialed her sister's number, needing to hear a familiar voice while she processed this unexpected development in her carefully planned civilian life. "Hey, you," Maria answered on the second ring. "How's life in the coffee capital of America?" "Interesting," Sarah replied. "I got a job offer today, security consulting work. That sounds like it would pay better than making lattes. Are you thinking about taking it?" Sarah walked to her bedroom window and looked out at the Portland skyline, lights beginning to appear as evening settled over the city. "I'm considering it. It would be part-time at first, just a few projects here and there." "What kind of security consulting? Like installing alarm systems or something?" "More like helping people in businesses assess vulnerabilities and develop protection strategies, training security personnel, that kind of thing." Maria was quiet for a moment, probably wondering how her sister had acquired expertise in security matters. Sarah had never fully explained her military background, allowing her family to believe she had worked in communications rather than direct combat roles. "It sounds like something you'd be good at," Maria finally said. "You always were the one who noticed things other people missed. Remember when we were kids and you could always tell when Dad was having a bad day before the rest of us figured it out?" Sarah smiled at the memory, realizing that her tactical awareness had roots that predated her military training. She had always been the family member who watched for signs of trouble, who planned escape routes, who thought strategically about potential problems. "I'm still thinking about it," Sarah said. "Change is hard, even when it might be positive." They talked for another 20 minutes about family news and holiday plans, the ordinary concerns that anchored Sarah to her civilian identity. When they hung up, she felt more connected to the world beyond military service and better equipped to evaluate Hayes' offer objectively. The business card remained on her dining table for 3 days before Sarah finally picked up her phone and dialed the number. Hayes answered on the first ring, her voice professional but welcoming. "I've been thinking about your offer," Sarah said. "I'd like to know more about what kind of projects you typically handle." "Excellent. Are you free for lunch tomorrow? I can show you some case studies and explain how the consulting process works." They met at a quiet restaurant downtown, Hayes arriving with a portfolio of previous projects that demonstrated the scope and importance of security consulting work. Shopping centers that needed threat assessment after vandalism incidents. Office buildings that wanted employee safety training. Residential complexes that required vulnerability analysis following break-ins. "The work is challenging without being dangerous," Hayes explained as they reviewed project summaries. "You use your training to help people protect themselves rather than to engage with threats directly." Sarah studied photographs of properties that had been evaluated and improved through professional security consultation. The work represented a way to serve others while maintaining the civilian life she had worked to establish. "Most clients never learn about our military backgrounds," Hayes continued. "They just know we understand security from a practical perspective and can provide solutions that actually work." The conversation lasted 2 hours, covering everything from client expectations to project timelines to compensation structures. By the time they finished lunch, Sarah had a clear understanding of what security consulting would require and how it would fit into her existing schedule. "I'm interested," Sarah said as they prepared to leave. "When could I start?" Hayes smiled and pulled out her phone. "I have a property assessment scheduled for next week. Small apartment complex that's had some break-in problems. Perfect introduction to the work." That evening, Sarah called Derek to explain that she would need occasional days off for consulting work. He was supportive and curious, asking questions about security consulting that she answered honestly without revealing the depth of her qualifications. "It sounds like you found a way to use skills you didn't know you had," Derek said. "I'm happy for you, and I'm glad you want to keep working here too." The first consulting project proved both familiar and novel. Sarah walked through the apartment complex with Hayes, identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited by criminals and developing recommendations for improvement. The work required her military training but applied it to civilian protection rather than combat operations. "You have excellent instincts for this," Hayes observed as they completed their assessment. "You see things that most people miss and understand how predators think." Sarah found satisfaction in using her training to help innocent people protect themselves rather than to engage with hostile forces. The apartment complex residents would benefit from improved lighting, better lock systems, and enhanced patrol procedures without ever knowing that their safety recommendations came from someone who had learned threat assessment in combat zones. Over the following months, Sarah developed a routine that balanced coffee shop work with security consulting projects. She pulled espresso shots and steamed milk 3 mornings a week, then spent occasional afternoons evaluating properties and training security personnel. The combination provided both the normalcy she craved and the professional challenge she needed. Her coworkers at Grind Coffee knew she did some consulting work but weren't curious about the details. Her consulting clients knew she had security expertise but didn't ask about its origins. Sarah had found a way to honor both aspects of her identity without compromising either. The apartment building where she lived had implemented several security improvements based on recommendations that Hayes had developed after reviewing the parking garage incident. Better lighting, additional cameras, improved patrol schedules. Other residents attributed the changes to routine security upgrades, unaware that their safety had been enhanced because one of their neighbors had demonstrated the importance of effective threat response. Sarah never learned what happened to Marcus, Kyle, and Danny after their failed robbery attempt. She occasionally wondered if they had abandoned criminal careers or simply become more careful about target selection. The encounter had lasted less Then 2 minutes, but had consequences that extended far beyond the parking garage where it occurred. 6 months after Hayes first approached her at the coffee shop, Sarah was working on a security assessment for a shopping center when she encountered a situation that reminded her why her skills remained important. A man was following a young woman through the parking lot, his movement patterns indicating predatory intent rather than coincidental direction. Sarah observed the situation from her position near the security office, noting the man's positioning and the woman's obvious discomfort. Rather than intervening directly, she contacted mall security and guided them to intercept the potential threat before it could escalate into an actual attack. The incident was resolved without violence or confrontation, the potential predator deterred by the presence of security personnel who had been alerted to his behavior. The young woman reached her car safely, probably never realizing that she had been in danger or that a former Navy SEAL had been watching over her from a distance. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment reviewing the day's events and considering how her life had evolved since leaving military service. She had found a way to serve others without carrying weapons or operating in hostile territory. She had learned to use her training to prevent violence rather than to apply it. She had discovered that protection could be as valuable as combat, that preventing threats was often more important than defeating them. The framed Navy SEAL trident on her dresser caught the light from her bedside lamp, its golden surface reflecting years of training and service that had shaped her into someone capable of protecting others. The insignia represented not just what she had accomplished, but what she had become: a guardian who operated from the shadows, a protector who asked for no recognition. Portland continued to be the quiet city where people could reinvent themselves without explaining their past. Sarah Martinez remained the coffee shop employee who pulled excellent espresso shots and remembered customer orders. She was also the security consultant who helped people protect themselves from threats they might never see coming. Her phone buzzed with a text from Hayes about a new project, a residential complex that needed comprehensive security evaluation. Sarah smiled as she typed her acceptance, grateful for work that allowed her to honor both aspects of her identity while serving people who would never know how much protection she provided. The next morning would bring another shift at Grind. Coffee, more customers seeking caffeine and conversation, more opportunities to practice the ordinary skills of civilian life. It would also bring another security consultation, another chance to help innocent people stay safe in a world where threats existed but could be managed through proper preparation and professional expertise. Sarah Martinez had learned that heroes didn't always wear uniforms or carry weapons. Sometimes they served coffee and remembered customer names. Sometimes they worked quietly behind the scenes to make other people's lives safer and better. Sometimes the most important victories were the ones that prevented conflicts rather than winning them. She had found her place in the civilian world, not by abandoning her military identity, but by transforming it into something that served others without requiring recognition or glory. She was exactly what she had always been, a warrior dedicated to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The difference was that now she did it while living the quiet, ordinary life that most people took for granted, using skills forged in extraordinary circumstances to ensure that ordinary life remained possible for everyone around her. 2 years had passed since that pivotal evening in the parking garage, and Sarah Martinez stood before a group of 20 security professionals at a Portland conference center, delivering a presentation on threat recognition and response protocols. The audience consisted of mall security supervisors, apartment complex managers, and corporate safety coordinators, all seeking to better protect the people under their care. The key to effective security isn't responding to threats, Sarah explained, clicking to her next slide. It's recognizing them before they become dangerous. She moved through the presentation with the confidence of someone who had learned these lessons through experience rather than textbooks. The PowerPoint slides showed statistics and case studies, but her explanations carried the weight of first-hand knowledge about how predators selected targets and how those selections could be disrupted. In the back of the room, Hayes watched with the satisfaction of a mentor whose student had exceeded expectations. Sarah had developed into one of the most sought-after security consultants in the Pacific Northwest, her reputation built on practical solutions that actually prevented crimes rather than simply documenting them after they occurred. Questions? Sarah asked as she concluded her presentation. A young man in a mall security uniform raised his hand. What if someone doesn't look threatening? How do you identify danger from people who seem normal? Sarah paused, remembering Marcus and his polite approach that had masked criminal intent. Behavior patterns matter more than appearance. Watch for coordination between multiple people, approaches that seem designed to isolate targets, and conversations that don't match the environment. She spent another 20 minutes answering questions that revealed how little most security personnel understood about actual threat dynamics. These were good people trying to protect others, but they had been trained to respond to obvious problems rather than subtle indicators that preceded violence. After the presentation, Sarah gathered her materials while participants approached with additional questions and business cards. Word of mouth had made her consulting services increasingly popular, but she remained selective about projects, choosing clients who genuinely wanted to improve safety rather than simply satisfy insurance requirements. Excellent presentation, said a woman in her 40s who introduced herself as the safety director for a chain of grocery stores. We've had some incidents in our parking lots that our current security can't seem to prevent. Sarah accepted the woman's card and scheduled a preliminary consultation, knowing that grocery store parking lots were common hunting grounds for criminals who targeted shoppers carrying cash and valuables. The work would be straightforward. Identify vulnerabilities, recommend improvements, train staff to recognize threats before they escalated. Hayes joined her as the conference room emptied. That was your best presentation yet. You've really found your voice in this work. Sarah nodded, surprised by how natural it felt to teach others about concepts that had once been classified military knowledge. Security consulting had become more than just a way to use her training. It had become a calling that fulfilled her need to serve others while maintaining her civilian identity. I have something I want to discuss with you, Hayes continued as they walked toward the parking garage. There's an opportunity in Seattle. Major consulting firm wants to hire someone to head their Pacific Northwest security division. The offer represented exactly the kind of career advancement that Sarah might have pursued during her military years. More responsibility, higher compensation, greater recognition for her expertise. It also represented a departure from the careful balance she had constructed between her two identities. It would mean leaving Portland, Sarah said, and probably working full-time instead of part-time. Hayes understood the implications. Sarah's life in Portland had provided the stability and anonymity that made civilian transition possible. Moving to Seattle for a high-profile position would change the fundamental nature of her post-military existence. Think about it, Hayes suggested. The offer will remain open for a few weeks. That evening, Sarah returned to her apartment with Hayes's words echoing in her mind. The Seattle opportunity represented professional success by any conventional measure, but it would require abandoning the coffee shop work that had become an important part of her identity. She found herself drawn to her bedroom dresser, where the framed Navy SEAL trident sat beside a photograph from her graduation ceremony at Grind Coffee's barista training program. The contrast between the images represented the dual nature of her civilian life, warrior and server, protector and provider of simple pleasures. Her phone rang with a call from Derek, probably dealing with another equipment crisis or scheduling issue. Sarah answered with the warmth reserved for people who had become genuine friends rather than just employers. Sarah, I hate to bother you at home, but we had a situation here tonight after closing. 3 guys tried to break into the shop through The back door. The alarm scared them off, but I wanted you to know. Sarah felt her tactical awareness sharpen automatically. Did you call the police? Yeah, they took a report and said they'd increase patrols in the area, but I'm worried about the morning shift tomorrow. What if these guys come back during business hours? The concern was legitimate. Criminals who attempted burglary might escalate to robbery if they encountered resistance or witnesses. Sarah's mind began processing security recommendations for the coffee shop that had never needed them before. I'll come in early tomorrow and walk through some safety protocols with the staff, she said. Basic awareness stuff that will help everyone stay safe. After they hung up, Sarah realized that her instinctive response to protect her coworkers had answered Hayes's question about the Seattle opportunity. Her life in Portland wasn't just about maintaining cover or pursuing professional advancement. It was about being present for people who had become important to her. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Grind Coffee an hour before opening and spent time with Derek and the other employees, teaching them how to recognize potential threats and respond appropriately. She showed them where to position themselves for maximum safety, how to use the shop's layout for protection, and when to prioritize escape over property protection. I had no idea you knew so much about security, Derek said as they prepared for the morning rush. Have you been doing this consulting work longer than I thought? Sarah smiled while arranging pastries in the display case. Some things you pick up along the way. The important thing is that everyone knows how to stay safe. The morning proceeded normally, with regular customers ordering their usual drinks and new faces discovering what made Grind Coffee special. Sarah found herself watching the entrance more carefully than usual, her training automatically activated by the previous night's attempted break-in. Around 10 o'clock, a familiar figure entered the shop. Marcus stood near the door for a moment, his appearance changed by 2 years and what looked like significant weight loss. He looked older, more tired, carrying himself with the defeated posture of someone whose life had not improved since their last encounter. Sarah continued preparing drinks while monitoring his movement through the shop. Marcus approached the counter slowly, his eyes meeting hers with recognition and something that might have been regret. "Could I get a black coffee?" he asked quietly. "Small." Sarah poured the coffee without comment, her professional demeanor revealing nothing about their shared history. Marcus placed exact change on the counter and accepted the cup with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying weight beyond simple politeness. He found a corner table and sat alone, drinking his coffee slowly while staring out the window at Portland's morning traffic. Sarah watched him peripherally while serving other customers, noting that he made no attempt to approach her directly or engage in conversation beyond the transaction. 20 minutes later, Marcus finished his coffee and stood to leave. As he passed the counter, he stopped and placed a folded piece of paper beside the register before walking out without another word. Sarah waited until the next customer lull before unfolding the paper. Written in careful handwriting was a simple message. "Thank you for the lesson. It changed everything." She folded the note and slipped it into her apron pocket, understanding that some lessons were valuable enough to transform lives in ways that the teacher never witnessed. Marcus had learned something important that night, in the parking garage, something that had apparently redirected his path away from predatory behavior. Derek noticed her thoughtful expression. "Everything okay? You look like you're processing something heavy." "Just thinking about how small actions can have bigger consequences than we realize," Sarah replied, returning to her work with renewed appreciation for the complexity of human transformation. That afternoon, Sarah called Hayes to decline the Seattle opportunity. The conversation was brief and understanding, with Hayes acknowledging that Sarah had found something in Portland that was worth preserving. "There will be other opportunities," Hayes said. "And you're doing important work here, even if it doesn't come with a fancy title." Sarah spent the evening in her apartment, reflecting on the path that had led her from military service to coffee shop work to security consulting. Each transition had required leaving something behind while discovering something new about herself and her capacity to serve others. The encounter with Marcus had reminded her that influence extended far beyond official roles or recognized achievements. Sometimes the most important impact came from moments of crisis when someone chose to respond with measured force rather than overwhelming violence, with teaching rather than punishment. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria asking about holiday plans. Sarah typed her response while looking out at Portland's evening skyline, grateful for a city that had allowed her to become someone new while honoring who she had always been. The coffee shop would open tomorrow with improved security awareness and staff who understood how to protect themselves and their customers. The security consulting business would continue helping property managers and safety directors create environments where threats were recognized and prevented. Sarah Martinez would continue serving both roles, finding meaning in work that protected others without requiring recognition or glory. She had learned that heroism wasn't about dramatic confrontations or celebrated victories. It was about showing up consistently for people who needed protection, whether they realized it or not. It was about using extraordinary skills in ordinary circumstances to ensure that ordinary life remained possible for everyone. The framed Navy SEAL trident reflected her bedside lamp's light as Sarah prepared for sleep, its golden surface unchanged by time, but representing experiences that had been transformed into something new. She had earned the right to wear that insignia through trials that had tested every aspect of her capabilities, but she had learned to honor it through service that asked for nothing in return. Portland slept peacefully around her, its residents unaware that their safety was enhanced by the presence of someone who had learned to fight, so that others wouldn't have to. Sarah Martinez had found her place in the civilian world by remaining exactly what she had always been, a warrior dedicated to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The difference was that now she did it while pulling espresso shots and remembering customer orders, using skills forged in extraordinary circumstances to preserve the ordinary moments that made life worth protecting. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.